In the West, we tend to idolize German military doctrine as being some sort of invincible juggernaut that was able to squash resistance in most of Europe during the Second World War. However, it has serious flaws that have often been overlooked because most amateur military historians, such as myself, tend to focus on the tactical realm of warfare rather than the strategic or operational realms of warfare. Now you're probably wondering, what's the difference between those three levels? And here I'll explain it to you in a very easy way. Now, the tactical level can be seen as the level of warfare that you see on the battlefield. You know, the tactics that are employed by opposing sides, and usually in pitched battles or whatnot. Well, not pitched battles. I mean, it could be pitched battles. But they tend to employ these tactics, for example, employing AT guns along roads hidden away in order to ambush incoming enemy tanks. That could be considered a tactic. And that's usually what wins battles in the more immediate sense. But if we look at the operational level, we start to see, the confluence, I'm not sure, of several smaller scale tactical battles, right? In which they act in conjunction with each other to attain strategic goals. The example that I give in my upcoming documentary is Operation Bagration, where the Soviets were able to perform tactical encirclements in Vitebsk, Mahilo, Bobruisk, and Minsk, especially Minsk. They were able to perform these tactical encirclements in order to obtain strategic goals of, for example, making it to the Vistula, recapturing all of Belarusia, and trying to direct armies toward Warsaw, right? So the operational level is sort of marrying the tactical realm of winning battles on the field with the strategic vision of a country. For example, the strategic vision could be, for example, Lend-Lease. For example, if we look at the Western Front, the invasion of Normandy to open a second front to alleviate Soviet pressure on the Soviets in the Eastern Front. That's a form of strategic thinking in warfare, or how Churchill, I think, wanted to focus on the Balkans rather than on Normandy. He didn't want to land troops on Normandy. So the reason I'm pointing this out is because the Germans placed an incredible amount of priority. They focused too much on the tactical realm of warfare, and this stems, as other YouTubers have pointed out, this stems from the fact that they're following an old tradition of warfare that's existed a lot. If we think about it, most battles before World War I were pitched battles, generally, where two opposing armies would meet in a designated area. It doesn't have to be designated, but they would meet in an area. They'd fight it out. There would be decisive battle sometimes, not all the time. And that would essentially determine the war for either side, just like that, with a couple of these battles. That's why if you go on Wikipedia, for example, and you look at past wars, they usually have straightforward chronologies, where this side fought this battle, then this side fought that battle, then there was a decisive battle, and that's it. That's how the war... There doesn't seem to be, large-scale fighting in between of those battles. The operational level, however, kind of compensates for the lack of this sort of thinking that warfare is sort of continuous, right? Because in World War I, essentially industrialization kind of forced armies to sort of have continuous front lines, right? Front lines that would continue from, the Western Front, from Belgium all the way to the border with Switzerland. And because of this continuous front lines, there was a risk for continuous fighting, and therefore a need for operations that would consider the different units that were placed in the theater of warfare. Now, a pitched battle, you just have two armies, they fight it out, that's it. But now with operational warfare, because of industrialization, you have multiple armies simultaneously struggling to encircle one another, and struggling to form breakthroughs to defend and whatnot. And that's part of the reason why German military doctrine, especially in World War II, was so flawed, because they didn't really refine their understanding of the operational art of warfare. Whereas the Soviets, their experiences in the Russian Civil War, particularly with the theoretician Tukhachevsky, totally called for mobility, but with an idea that, for example, units would be constantly shifting front lines. Units would be constantly moving. It gives the impression that the Soviets were thinking, especially during the Russian Civil War, they were thinking that the front line was constantly changing, constantly evolving. Therefore, armies were constantly fighting with one another. This idea of pitched warfare went straight out the window with the movement of the front line. Because the Soviets, they mobilized. And especially the White Armies, they mobilize massive formations. So you have the idea of the front line essentially springs up. It springs up in World War I, but it comes to fruition even further in the Russian Civil War, right? Now, I made a video about the history of conscription and reserves. It's my most popular video, and it kind of plays into this idea that it's ironic that the Prussians and the Germans were the first to institute mass mobilization, but in reality they were one of the last to really understand the level of operations, and that battles couldn't be fought decisively in pitched combat. They had to develop with intricate operations, and you see this lack of planning, especially in Operation Barbarossa. They're initially successful, but a lot of the encircled Soviet units end up escaping because the Germans don't have enough motorized units to secure the inner encirclements, especially in Belarusia in 1941. So, and they also lack a bit of a strategic vision. Initially Hitler just wanted the German army to encircle as many Soviet soldiers as possible, because this would surely force a decisive action and force the Soviets to surrender. And also he had issues with his commanders, whether to attack, to force an attack in Ukraine or continue in Moscow. The whole debacle with the encirclement of Kiev kind of points to this lack of coordination in the operational sphere, and everything seems sort of improvised. Essentially, the Germans, they had Bewegungskrieg, right? They had Bewegungskrieg, which was maneuver warfare, lightning warfare, pretty much, in a way, not blitzkrieg. But Bewegungskrieg essentially emphasized on maneuver and attacking vulnerable positions in the front line, in the flanks of the enemy, right? The Germans performed this in the Ardennes when they attacked the vulnerable position, and they pretty much enveloped the Allies at a focal point, right? The Germans, they pretty much thought, we need to find a weak point in the front line. We need to exploit it and focus on that weak point, mainly with our tanks, especially in conjunction with aircraft, and form a breakthrough, a decisive breakthrough, or Schwerpunkt in that area. And then we can exploit with mechanized infantry and form encirclements. This kind of flies in the face of Soviet doctrine that instead worked a little something like this. Essentially, you have a front line, like so, and the Soviets would put their infantry and artillery in the first echelon of the area that they want to break through, right? This would increase firepower, and they would also have a bit of tanks, but this would increase firepower in order to break through in that point and kind of wear down the German defenses. This would usually be called a shock army, or they would have combined arms armies, or rifle armies as well, but it's usually the shock army that does the breakthrough. Following the shock army, you'd have mechanized and mobile groups from the second echelon, pretty much behind the front line. They would come in and be the exploitation force that would create the situations for encirclements. So whereas the Germans with Bewegungskrieg, they would attack with tanks at the get-go, because essentially they're focusing on vulnerable positions. So the Germans don't really need to worry about wearing down their mobile units and their tanks, because they're attacking vulnerable positions from the get-go. The Soviets didn't really emphasize on attacking vulnerable positions. They emphasized on kind of attacking positions and forming breakthroughs in the areas where they felt they needed to do a breakthrough. And they do this with a shock army first to wear down the enemy, and once the enemy was worn down, at the last minute they would introduce tanks and their tank armies and mobile units in order to further that exploitation. So whereas the Germans, their doctrine seemed more in line with pre-operational doctrine, because if you think about it, pitched battles, since you don't have a front line forming in pitched battles, it's very easy to envision wars of maneuver and outflanking, because the enemy army doesn't really have other armies to protect its operational flanks, Whereas in World War II and World War I, that wasn't the case. Enemy armies had continuous front lines, and they had armies that could protect their operational flanks. Therefore, the Soviets understood this, and as a result, they thought, there's no point in focusing on our energies and finding vulnerabilities in the enemy's flanks or the enemy's front line. Rather, we should create those vulnerabilities using shock armies and then exploit them. So the Soviet, what I like about Soviet doctrine compared to German doctrine, it seems much more in tune with how front lines developed in modern warfare, but it also, Soviet doctrine seems much more in tune with modern warfare, but it's not really basing things on chance as much as German doctrine bases things on. If you look at Operation Citadel, it seemed like the Germans were just initiating, the Battle of Kursk based on the chance that they thought they had, because of the vulnerable Soviet flanks, and it seemed like they weren't really creating a situation for a breakthrough. So they were just the Germans were essentially using their environment a bit too much, rather than taking the initiative and creating their own prospects for a breakthrough. The second thing is you can see this further with the and you could see this further with Operation Bagration. According to Soviet Stavka reports, the German defenses around the Orsha-Minsk highway, Minsk-Smolensk or Minsk-Moscow highway, they were quite fortified. The Germans were quite fortified there, as well as by Vitebsk, right, and especially by Bobruisk in the southern part of the operation. And these were actually the locations that the Soviets launched their main attacks. The first Belarusian front launched an attack towards Bobruisk, and I believe the third Belarusian front, which was actually the main front, launched its attack toward Vitebsk, but mainly between Vitebsk and Orsha, and also a little through Orsha to Minsk, the highway. So it shows that the Soviets weren't necessarily relying on finding vulnerabilities by chance. They were creating these situations. Of course, if the Germans had gaps in the front, they would exploit those gaps. But they weren't necessarily gonna create like sort of crazy, like they weren't gonna create crazy chance-based operations like, you know, the invasion of France through the Ardennes, which was incredibly risky and nobody really likes talking about it. So of course we could also see this because the Belarusian fronts were very concentrated, especially the first Belarusian front going towards Bobruisk. So, you know, it just shows that it feels a bit more sophisticated than German doctrine, which was, you know, as military history visualized pointed out, based on tradition and kind of a bit archaic and counterintuitive, because the Germans were the first ones to really introduce mass mobilization and, you know, mass warfare, total warfare. Yet in the way they conducted actual warfare, it seemed to be the antithesis of this, because they were basing things as if they were still pitched battles, right? So that's my main concern, which is why I think German military doctrine is severely flawed. You know, elastic defense is another story entirely, but this is just referring to that. Lastly, I'd like to say that the Soviets, they really emphasized on double envelopments. You could see this with Rokossovsky and how he wanted to do a double envelopment of Bobruisk, whereas the Germans, they just wanted to concentrate on a focal area, you know, the Schwerpunkt, you know, that area. And it just shows that they're kind of putting all their eggs in one basket and really concentrating on an area based on chance, right? Whereas the Soviets, no, it's more coordinated. We're going to do a breakthrough here and a breakthrough here. It just seems a bit more, I cringe when I say this, but a bit more scientific in military science, in terms of military science. So I hope you've taken something away from this video, just a bit of a sort of teaser toward what I'm going to be talking about in my Operation Bagration video. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about the actual development of the operation. However, I'm also going to be focusing more on these theoretical approaches, because I think it's very important to understand the significance of the operation. So until next time, I guess, see you all later, and I hope you enjoyed this.